The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello, everyone. We are at the top of the hour and getting ready to start our webinar today entitled How to Utilize Virtual Audits to Dramatically Reduce Your Supplier Risk. I'm so happy to have you all join us today. I appreciate your presence, and I'm sure you're going to glean some valuable insight and perhaps a few nuggets of valuable intel as well that you'll be able to take back to your organizations. Before we start, I've got just a couple of housekeeping items I wanted to review with you. First of all, if you have any questions, the plan is to leave some time afterwards to go through as many questions as we can. Just make sure to add them to the questions section of the panel, the GoToWebinar control panel that you see here. And as I say, we're going to try and save some time to answer as many of your questions as we can. We have some resources for you that you'll be able to access after the webinar. We will be emailing the slide deck to everyone that attended, as well as a recording of the event. And if you have any questions, or if any of your questions were answered, please feel free to reach out to us at marketing@sourceintelligence. So the plan for today is I'm going to introduce our stellar panelists. I'm very excited to have these two gentlemen with us today. The first presentation will cover supply chain risk management, the new imperative by Dr. Chris Gopal, and then Terry Clark is going to address mitigating supply chain risks with virtual audits. He's going to touch on the technology side of things for us. And I will be discussing and adding some commentary with regard to best and leading practices for post-audit activities. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we'll leave some time for questions as well. So let me introduce our panelists. We have with us Dr. Chris Gopal. He has over 35 years of experience in global supply chain and operations with organizations such as Dell, Ernst & Young, Unisys, and SAIC. He has consulted with leading businesses across all industries. He's a former member, and he was nominated to the Defense Business Board, providing Secretary, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and other senior leaders with trusted, independent, and objective advice on business practices. He's on the Supply Chain Advisory Board of the Global Fund, a global Geneva-based NGO that seeks to eradicate tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV as pandemics through the provision and delivery of healthcare and medication. He's the co-author of 3 books. He speaks at major forums, so we're lucky to have us here at our most humble forum. He currently consults with leading companies. He serves on advisory boards and teaches at USC and UCSD. It's University of Southern California and University of California, San Diego. His doctorate is from the University of Southern California, and his master's in business administration is from the Cranfield School of Management in the UK. Speaking of the UK, we have Terry Clark, who joins us from the UK. Terry is the CEO and co-founder of BuildStream. He has over 12 years of experience managing supply chain sustainability and quality issues for both small businesses as well as large corporations. Terry's an entrepreneur, having started several successful technology companies. Terry earned his bachelor's in architectural technology from Northumbria University and a master's in renewable energy from Newcastle University. And as well as myself, you all know me, Jennifer Krause, Chief Scientific Officer with Source Intelligence. So what I'd like to do, without any further ado, is turn it over to Dr. Gopal to get us started. Chris?
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me?
We sure can. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, everybody, for attending today and giving us your time. And hopefully we'll make this interesting, enjoyable, and useful to all of you. So I'd like to start off by talking about supply chain risk management, the new imperative. Before I start, a little bit of anecdotal history. 5 years ago, when I was on the boards of different companies, 6 years ago, nobody ever mentioned the term risk. It was part of those things that you thought just took care of itself. Today, if you attend every big analyst meeting, company meetings, whatever, risk is one of the key aspects of the discussion. And it doesn't matter what the risk is about. There are many risks, and we'll talk about them today. The other thing I'd like to just talk about is this concept of the new normal. Oh, can you go back, please? The new normal, which is a term that's used by so many different people as if to say everything has changed, and it's changed so dramatically that there's a new environment coming forward. I'd like to say that there is no new normal. It's just the same as it's always been, but it's ever changing. It's the ever changing normal. And we still have the supply chain, the customers, the suppliers, providers, and so on, working capital. What's really changed is the structure, risks, concentration, behavior of people, priorities, and all of those things. But the essential supply chain is the same. It's the components and the priorities that have changed, and particularly the risks. And talking about risks, we ask ourselves, how do risks manifest themselves? Vulnerabilities. And the best way to ask and answer this question, as I've found in talking with senior executives, is to ask a few questions. Next slide, please. So you ask yourself, what would happen? And I'll just go through a few of these points. You don't have to go through all of them. What would happen if your key supplier failed financially? What would happen if they had a facility breakdown, a collapse in the factory, as has happened today in China, in many of the plants over there? What would happen if supplies from one of their key suppliers have been disrupted, or heavens forbid, were closed down by a major pandemic, or even, think about it, had a major problem because of ocean or air freight capacity and shipping? So today there was a article in the paper in La Jolla, where we live, about the crossing at the Mexico border, Otay Mesa, one of the smaller crossing points in the country, but still a big one. There are thousands and thousands of trailers sitting there waiting for drivers, something nobody could have expected. Next slide, please. We also ask ourselves, what would happen if our key supplier was in the middle of a political crisis that disrupted their supplies, or was caught shipping to internationally sanctioned countries like the Congo, North Korea, things like that, or heaven forbid, decided to steal your IP and develop a competing product, or gave your IP to its government? All of these, if the answer is hard, then it's a risk and a vulnerability you've got to look at. But that's not all. Next slide, please. Ask about your key customer. What if your key customer arbitrarily demanded that you drop your prices? Okay, I paid you so much, I'm going to pay you so much less. Take it or leave it. Or required you to change how we deliver overnight. Or, as so many did over this last year, arbitrarily reduce their commitment to buy, legally or not, or suffer for a downturn of their own demand. What would happen? And these are risks as well. Next. Okay. And finally, let's take that and talk about the different categories and types of risk that all of these questions entail. The big issue here is we tend to define risk in terms of the things we see in everyday business. As you can see from the pictures all to the side, the Fukushima Daiichi tsunami, which disrupted a lot of the auto industry and electronics industry. Coronavirus, obviously, we know all about that. Cybersecurity. But there are a whole lot of other risks that can happen. For instance, government, political, and military action. The stuff that's going on right now over Taiwan has the potential to disrupt further a whole lot of supply chains. Political events, trade barriers and restrictions. Internal risks. Let's never forget, we have a lot of internal risks, including our own IT department, our own planning department, and so on. Terrorism and cybersecurity. And you can read these. These are all the different categories of risk that one must look at, one must address. So for instance, some of the things that we've been talking about in a different forum, a different set of executives, that we want to do is try and mitigate risks before they happen. So don't ask the general specific type of risk. What happens if a container ship went overboard? Or what happens if there's a port strike in Long Beach, or any of those things? But take it at a higher level and say, what happens if our supply is disrupted because of a supply issue, a government issue, a transportation issue? And we can then start making sense of these. But the point is, there are a whole lot of different risks that we have to face. And what do we do about it? Well, next slide, please. We respond to it. We anticipate it. Basically, we monitor it, mitigate, and respond to the risk. And this is a process that companies are finding out every day that requires intelligence, insight, and decision-making. It's all about insights and intelligence. So let's start off with this. The first piece is audits, periodic audits of suppliers, providers, supply lines, customers. There's analyses, hard quantitative analysis. What's our time to recovery? What's our cost to recovery? What do we have to do so that we don't have any problem whatsoever? And finally, there's risk monitoring, the monitoring of all these risks that we select, continuous and periodic. There are companies that provide this to us, and we should take advantage of that. And Terry will talk a little bit about that as we go forward, because there's just too much for individual executives to do at the same time. So you can monitor your risk, you select them as you like. Some should be monitored continuously. I would say the stuff happening on the ocean right now, some quarterly, some monthly, some weekly, but they should be monitored and reported on. And the time horizons can vary between 2+ years, way out, to a few months. Essentially, what we're doing is we monitor all these risks, we select them, we look at the risks from the point of view of type. What's going to be the most important to us? What impacts us the most? And the likelihood of it happening. And believe me, I've been in this business for some time looking at risks, and the risks that we thought were unlikely a couple of years ago have all happened. And unless you monitor, unless you assess, you'll never get a clue as to what's coming to you. We look at the outcomes and metrics and then make the decisions to have risk mitigation strategies. And I've just put down a few of the samples sample strategies that companies that I know and the government and health funds use to mitigate risk. Things like supply diversification. Okay. Somebody once said, it couldn't have been me, because I'm not that smart, that you get the same results if you do the same things over and over again. And that's the way companies are doing right now. Some of them, they were burned sourcing in one particular country, such as China. It's gone off, they've come back, they've got the government money, they're going back again. They're looking at unit cost as opposed to risk and supply assurance. Supplier relocation, postponement strategies, designing things into products. For instance, one of the biggest risks that we have today is product integrity, things like conflict minerals, things like REACH and RoHS. The bad things that can happen to you if your products contain these things. How do I mitigate those risks? So there's a whole bunch of risks that fall out and strategies that fall out from our evaluation of risk. Next slide, please. So some sage advice. You know, I believe that just like there is no new normal, it's all changing. There are no new management insights in the world. So I'd like to give you some from a few years ago, like maybe 200, from one of the great management theorists, which applies completely to what we're talking about today. When you plan for risk, the enemy of a good plan is the dream of a perfect plan. So you plan at a high level. The world has a way of undermining complex plans. It certainly does. A fast-moving environment like coronavirus, like the shipping crisis we're going through right now, can evolve more quickly than a complex plan can be adapted to. For intelligence and decision-making, the difficulty of accurate recognition is one of the most serious sources of frictions, making things appear entirely different from what one had expected. How many of us had expected something like the shipping crisis that's going on right now? I have a call every morning, it's no joke, every morning for one of the organizations I work with and that I serve to talk about this. What can we do differently? How can we look at the costs to get things here quickly? I'll show you something here, risk. This is a receipt from a big paint company. Every line item has something called a supply chain surcharge of 4%. This is a risk nobody saw coming. So they're passing it on. And finally, history has no lessons or rules to offer the student. It just broadens one's understanding. So let's not discuss this silly thing of best practices and leading practices. It's all situational. It goes into your mindset and gives you the ability to manage risks. And the next one, okay. So just some key management imperatives since we started talking about that. The ever-changing normal. Risk management has to be a process with monitoring and measurement. It must be an executive level function operation. There are at least 3 big companies I know, plus a major government organization that's appointing senior risk executives. Okay. Plan for the broad risks, okay, things like that. The more foreseeable the risk, the more it must be monitored. And there are companies today that do what's called continuous monitoring of unstructured data to give you an idea as to what's coming down. It must be updated because in the past, and I'm using one particular company as an example, a risk analysis was done about 4 years ago and never was updated. And people are now saying, oh, that was all wrong. No, things have just changed. And finally, risk must be embedded in the decision-making process. It's critical that we look at risk as one of the key variables and decision parameters. We talk about people, process, technology. Today, it's people, process, technology, and risk. So with that, I'll leave you. And Jennifer, back to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate your comments. I honed in on von Clausewitz quote there that you had, by the time you've adapted, the target has changed. Oh, isn't that the truth? And I think, Terry, your comments on technology and how technology can support the use of virtual audits as a way to monitor risk, we'll perhaps touch on a bit of that. So I'll turn it over to you, Terry.
Thank you. Right, yeah, thanks everybody. So I'm Terry Clark, the CEO and co-founder of BuildStream, and BuildStream is a platform to manage supply chain audits and inspection in terms of the labour element. So looking forward to talking you through some of the technology that people are starting to use in the market today. So next slide, Charlotte, please. So first of all, what is a virtual audit? Now, we class it as when you engage the client and auditor through technology, and there are three different factors on it. The approach that you take, so whether it's on-site supported by virtual technologies or completely off-site. The communication element of it, so that means communicating and sharing documents, team meetings, recording minutes of meetings, and streaming visits around facilities. And then the tasks that are undertaken in a virtual audit. So this can often include document reviews, site tours, interviews with personnel, process analysis, and then a presentation back to the management team of the findings. Next slide. So then just some examples of some of the main audit types. So, you know, it might be a manufacturing audit where you're checking the supplier's capability to build the product to the specification that you require. It might be an ethical audit where you're looking at labour conditions and pay. It could be a structural audit of the buildings and premises that one of your suppliers is using, making sure that they're safe and consistent, and will remain open and won't cause problems in your supply chain. And then environmental, so making sure that your suppliers are compliant with local laws and regulations so that they're not hitting problems and their supply into you is going down. Next slide. So since 2020, when COVID kicked off, there's been quite a big change in the demand for virtual audits. It's grown 900%. Now, this has been driven by three key aspects, and number one is travel restrictions. So where you would previously potentially send an internal employee out to go and audit a supplier, that's been far more difficult. So that's driven demand for remote audits. Regulatory changes, so we've had a few. There's been Brexit, for example, over between the UK and the EU. That's increased the need to audit existing suppliers as the rules and regulations have changed. You need to make sure that they're compliant. And then the trade war and tariffs. So supply chains that have been in place for years have had to realign, have been disrupted. Previous suppliers might not be available to you anymore. So when you're trying a new supplier, you need to put them through an audit process to de-risk that new supply. Next slide. So there are several benefits of virtual audits, and we've listed a few here. First of all, sorry, my screen cuts off there. It's more flexible and responsive. So you can quickly spin up a virtual audit and probably get that done quicker than it would have previously if you were sending somebody physically to site. It can be more time efficient. You can cover more area and more sites in one go. It can be better value for money. So with less travel and less personnel actually on site, that offers a big cost saving. And it can increase engagement. So being able to communicate the audit process and then the audit findings digitally means you can reach a bigger audience than if you were doing that in person. And then you can also access a wider workforce of audit professionals. So the global workforce has opened up in the last 18 months to 2 years now. So virtual audits offer a way to access the best people no matter where they are in the world. It can also help your project stay on schedule. So by being a little bit quicker generally than a physical audit, you can get the audit process done more quickly and then onboard that supplier or get back to work. And then also the reduced carbon footprint. So that's an easy one, far less travel required by doing things digitally. Next slide. So what we're going to look at here is the kind of 5 key ways that technology can support virtual audits. The first one is sourcing qualified auditors efficiently. The next one is mobile streaming, and then we're going to slightly more technical immersive streaming, and then aerial data capture, and then finally looking at some basic tools for streaming and communication that probably most people here would have access to, that can really be a great way to get started with virtual audits. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So really the first step when undertaking a virtual audit is making sure that you can get access to the right person. We need to make sure that they're properly qualified, they've got the right experience, and that they're reliable. Now, there's really been kind of two key routes that people would use to source the right people. It will either be from their existing network or a professional network like LinkedIn, or perhaps a job board, or people will often turn to agencies, and there are positives and negatives of both of those. And what we do at Buildstream is we're kind of a hybrid of both. We're a digital platform that kind of merges the agency service with LinkedIn. Some things to consider. In fact, next slide first. Yeah, so some things to consider. You know, the qualifications and the experience of the auditor. You really want to be getting copies of their qualifications and checking their validity. If you can have a third party that does that for you, obviously they need to take responsibility for that. There might be a cost, but it can speed up your process. One thing that is often overlooked is the availability of people and backfilling if somebody cancels. So particularly when you're doing an audit that's in a different geography to where you might have a footprint, finding the right person to backfill if somebody cancels last minute can be a real risk. Cross-border hiring. So if you're trying to manage your sourcing an auditor internally, you need to make sure that the way that you hire them is compliant with the local laws in the geography that they're based. And then finally, costs and audit coverage. Virtual audits offer a really nice way, we think, to reduce the cost, which might mean that you can bank that cost saving, or you can actually extend your audit program and undertake more audits with that same budget. And then you need to weigh up the cost and benefit between using agencies and managing it internally. Obviously, you know, agencies have been around for a long time. They can be more expensive. Sometimes they can be a little bit faster or slower, it depends. But then managing things internally, you know, how is your team set up to source people in different locations, payrolling them if they're based in a different geography, and then managing all the admin. Things like Excel, spreadsheets, and emails tend to not scale too well. So, you know, these are some of the key things to consider. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So first of all, we take a look at mobile streaming, and this is really, you know, how can you get to site and share what you're seeing for the audit audience. Now, there are some really quick and easy tools to get going. FaceTime and WhatsApp, we've been using those for remote inspections and audits recently. People just flip up their phone and share a video. There are also more specialized tools. A company called LibreStream does hardware that's used for remote auditing. They have a lot of you know, head-mounted cameras, freestanding cameras, and then also the good old tablets, you know, iPads, for example. Can be a nice way to you know, move around site with information available that you can share with that immediate audience, and you know, access different information quickly as you walk around undertaking your virtual audits. So some of the pros and cons, these basic options are very often free. They're really accessible to anybody with a device. Sometimes the image, sound, and quality might not quite be, well, it definitely isn't the same quality as being there physically in person. You know, bandwidth issues might mean that there's some quality drop off there that might mean that you actually can't get the level of detail that you need to check something in fine detail. And then you need to just weigh up the cost and benefit of paid options. Are these free options good enough, or should you upgrade to something a little bit more specialized and paid, for example, like a LibreStream? Next slide, please. So then we move on to the next level of advancement, which is immersive streaming. So this would really be, you know, headsets and augmented reality. Now these are these use a lot in engineering and construction projects. They're great because you can combine multiple data sets. You can bring in one source of truth drawings and check the drawing against the as-built, for example. There are some issues though, you know, compatibility. Is everybody up to speed with that particular type of hardware? Does the software communicate effectively? Can you get the data out and share it? And then also, you know, everybody needs a headset. So if you have, you know, a lack of access, that can sometimes be an issue. But again, I think that leads into why this is quite a specialized use case, mostly for, you know, engineering and some types of manufacturing and construction. Next slide. And this is just an example of Bosch's system where they're overlaying a technical drawing onto an actual video stream of a part that looks like an engine. So you can really bring the actual real world and merge that with the drawing specifications. Next slide. And then onto some of the basic tools that can be used for static streaming and communication. And this is really kind of the entry level. If you're undertaking virtual audits, you're going to be coming across some of these tools because you're probably working across different stakeholders. You'll have your own organization, you might have a third party inspector or auditor organization, you'll have the party being audited, and you might have some other stakeholders as well. So for these main tasks, one of the first ones is document reviews, and there can be lots of different tools there. The Microsoft Office suite, Google Suite, file sharing platforms like Dropbox, and something to consider there is, are they compatible and accessible? And then the next one is team communication, and this sounds, it might sound menial, but it can be difficult sometimes getting compatibility across what people are used to using in their organization. A lot of corporates are on Teams, a lot of newer businesses and startups like us are on the Google Suite. Today we're using GoToWebinar, so it can just, there's different tools that need to be considered there. And then it's scalability. So obviously, email is ubiquitous, but does it scale for a virtual audit? If you're exchanging information, sometimes that can be a bit problematic. And then you also have messaging tools. So something that's getting used more widely in enterprises is Slack. You can share files, you can do video calls on there even now, and you can chat. And then you also have SMS. Now, what's interesting about these is that they're kind of informal ways to chat, and I think we need to be mindful that sometimes you might have information being shared there that might not be being recorded, and you need to also make sure that we're logging important information and it's not being lost, so that it's not useful for the virtual audit. Next slide, please. So yeah, just touching over some of the pros and cons. So these basic tools are free and ubiquitous, and they're very easy to get going with. But some of the challenges that we need to think about is, can multiple stakeholders all converge onto that one file sharing system or that one document sharing tool? Compatibility of file types, that's getting better. So, for example, Google Docs and Microsoft Word, they're quite compatible now, but it's just something to consider. And then keeping one source of truth for the audit plan. So, is there a place among all these tools where everything is kind of logged and managed? Access rights and control. So, making sure that information that's really important for the virtual audit is kind of boxed in within that process and within those stakeholders. So leaving access open to central documents is, can be a risk. So something to think about there is, creating copies that might just be specific for the audit, non-disclosure agreements and commercial agreements that can protect you there from information leakage. And then also capturing communications for future reference. So making sure that the information is being captured so that it can be used in future and learn from. And I think where these basic tools kind of converge is that you're never going to be able to avoid them. And I think what's useful is to have a tool that kind of sits on top of that can kind of bring together the plan and easy to use to-do lists, very clear plans with information from the other sources feeding in. So Source Intelligence, I think, is a good example of that. A nice, easy to use tool that doesn't hit these compatibility issues, and gives you the flexibility to use the other tools outside, but all the stakeholders can come centrally to the audit plan. Next slide. And that's me. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Any questions?
Well, thank you so much, Terry, for those thoughts. I certainly appreciate that. And so we've received some really good insight, I think, from Chris regarding risks in the supply chain today, and how important risk monitoring has become. This isn't your mother's supply chain anymore. And Terry, you've provided an excellent overview on how we can use technology for a very specific type of a risk monitoring tool, which is the virtual audit. So what I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes or so is really focus on leading best practices in the field of virtual audits. So, you've completed that virtual audit. Now what? What do you do to respond, to manage and mitigate those risks? So Terry sort of hit on the benefits of virtual audits. There's less time, you spend less time, less money, fewer resources, less time having to gather, correlate, format, summarize the information, less time analyzing and evaluating the results and the implications of those data, because you're relying on technology to do that and not an Excel spreadsheet and formulas to do that for you. One key point that I wanted to make sure I shared, and that is that, automation is really an enabler for us. It's not going to replace the auditor, as Terry mentioned. Having a qualified auditor, someone that's familiar with the space, someone that has the proper qualifications, training, perhaps certifications to do the work that we need them to do is critical. We still need those individuals, but what technology has the potential to do is basically transform the audit and that auditor's role. But the auditor is really the one that's going to provide that context and judgments based on the data, the analyses, and the correlations that are being identified. So we're all very familiar with the common, standard post-audit follow-up activities. We implement corrective actions or preventive actions to address deficiencies or to address gaps. And it's those deficiencies and gaps that create risk, that generate risk. Due diligence, for those of you that are familiar with the conflict minerals requirements, both here in the US and in the EU, due diligence is an important component of that. So engaging in due diligence to minimize the risk associated with utilizing 3TG that's sourced from high-risk areas. Management reviews, for those of you that come from the management system world, whether it's ISO 14001 or 9001 or OSAS, management reviews are also very common best practices following an audit. That is getting with senior leadership and top management and reviewing the status and performance. The key is ensuring follow-up and setting and enforcing a schedule for the same, because it is by implementing those corrective and preventive actions that you're going to enable compliance and that you're going to be able to mitigate those risks. So these are common best practices. What I'd like to talk about today are what I'm going to refer to as leading practices or leading best practices. And they're those that are listed here, and I'm going to go into detail into each one of these in the next few minutes. But the first is really deriving intelligence from the data, not just limiting yourself to the raw data and raw information, but what exactly is this data telling you? What can we learn from it that will allow us to perhaps preempt or predict potential risks or deficiencies? The other is integrating with other data sources, whether they're publicly data sources or other data sources that you may have at your disposal. I'm also going to talk about identifying opportunities for automation within operations. Terry hit a little bit on that. Continuous auditing and continuous monitoring. These are all leading best practices. Another is exploring the use of machine learning capabilities of artificial intelligence for more accurate estimates of impacts or failures across business processes or business units across an entire corporation. Another leading best practice is the use of IP lookups to verify an auditee or factory location or identity. And the last is supplier engagement and training. So let me go through each one of these here as an example. So when we talk about leading best practices and deriving intelligence for the data, what do I mean by that? Well, when you're collecting data and information during a supply chain virtual audit, don't just limit yourself to just looking at trends in the data. Take the opportunity to assess risk from those results. Chris talked about how very important it is to begin to start thinking about risk. So for example, you can develop a scoring mechanism based on factors that are important to your specific business. Factors such as sourcing reliability or the presence of weak or forced labor in your supply chain. You know, that's going to vary depending on your business sector, your business culture. And then what you're going to do is assign scores based on those responses, then aggregate those scores based on a particular risk algorithm. It sounds complicated, but it really doesn't have to be complicated. It can be super simple. In fact, the simpler the better, to be perfectly honest. It's easier to manage, easier to implement, frankly, easier to scale. We see this time and time again. More complicated doesn't necessarily mean better, but it makes it easier for you, the owner, to manage, and for your suppliers as well to participate in the process. So that's one example. And here's another example of deriving intelligence from the data. If we look at the next slide, and that is giving yourself an opportunity to benchmark. So if you have a robust and automated system to implement and manage your supply chain virtual audit, you should have the option to benchmark within the same. So it'll give you an opportunity to say, okay, how do my supplier responses compare to each other? And this can be important and a unique opportunity to compare within a specific cohort with one very important factor in common. That is, they're all your suppliers. They share that in common. So in this example, for instance, when we're benchmarking against audit results, you'll see that there are some laggards with respect to this particular supply chain policy requirement. So what this does is it opens up opportunities for continuous improvement within this cohort based on that score and supplier risk assessment that we just talked about. So if this had been identified as a critical factor, a decision could be made to change that business relationship perhaps with the supplier. And this, could be as severe as terminating that relationship or just simply restructuring or changing the contractual relationship with that supplier as well. So benchmarking is another really great way to derive intelligence from your data and give you some additional insights. So if we move on to the next slide, it's basically, it's all about risk, right? So when we analyze patterns in the data, this helps identify risk, which in turn helps us more specifically target interventions to adequately address that risk. So for example, let's say that a group of suppliers lack in their commitment to health and safety training for employees. This is an important data point, but even more significant is understanding why those suppliers lack in their commitment to health and safety training for employees. Is it just a lack of resources, or is it a genuine lack of concern? If it's the former, there may be an opportunity to address that lack of resources via some sort of knowledge share arrangement, policy share. If the latter, then we go back to what we just talked about, and maybe you change the nature of your relationship with that particular supplier. But also, how does this group of suppliers who lack in their commitment to health and safety differ from the others? Are they located in a specific geographical region? If so, you can tailor due diligence that is culturally appropriate for that region. Are they limited to a certain business sector? Are they all, small to medium enterprises as opposed to larger organizations? So understanding the patterns and the relationships in the data will help you develop a more effective due diligence efforts and program. So here's another example where I mentioned integrating your results with other sources of data, such as regulatory agency data sets or import-export data sets. This is really kind of neat. And again, if you're taking advantage of automation for your virtual auditing efforts, you'll have a much easier time doing this than if you're trying to do it manually, because it'll provide you with a unique opportunity to integrate your findings of the audit with these publicly available data sources to further add context to your estimate of risk. So what have we seen and learned in the last 18 months? Well, global rates of disease infections, hospitalizations, and deaths directly impact factory activities. We all know this. And as Chris mentioned, there's ships sitting in the ocean just west of us here with nowhere to unload their stuff, and we're all waiting on stuff that's supposedly being shipped in, on its way. It's supposed to be there yesterday. It'll be there in 5 months. Who the heck knows? But by tracking these rates proactively, by tracking these trends proactively, you can make decisions regarding sourcing before the negative impact occurs. So you can shift supplies, you can shift sourcing supplies from one factory to another. You can build and establish backup contracts with backup factories to supplement shipping, let's say. So, think about integrating your audit findings with other public data sources, like global drought indices, for instance. Are some of your contract manufacturers heavy water users? Do they operate in drought impacted areas? All of these types of things can be considered to provide you a much bigger, broader, and more robust understanding of the potential risk associated with your supply chain. So moving on, what about integrating with findings from automated news feeds for additional risk insights? How many different types of media are there out there driving our opinions, our beliefs, our decisions? Whether that's good or bad is a whole nother topic. We don't have time for today. But how about integrating news media feeds with your audit findings for additional risk insights? These feeds can give you insight into events that could impact your supply chain reliability. For example, if you've linked your system for deriving supply chain intelligence to media sources, you may learn that truckers are considering a strike next month in one particular part of the country. And you can use this intelligence to make alternative shipping arrangements for products to avoid delivery delays. So knowledge of potential security data breaches in a business integral to your supply chain's viability will give you an opportunity to jump on corrective and preventive actions before those impacts become irreversible. So those are some examples in which of ways in which we can leverage and take advantage of news media feeds to give you even more insight into potential risk. I talked a little bit about the GOP lookup address to verify auditee identity. We've used this fairly successfully in over the last year or so, I'd say 12 to 18 months or so, and that is verifying where a particular user is located that's providing data and providing information. So if you've deployed a virtual audit to a particular factory, you are presumably expecting that the users that are completing that virtual audit tool, let's say it's some sort of a questionnaire or survey, are physically located at that factory, but that's not always the case. And it can be very insightful to find out where specifically the users are that are providing data to that virtual audit. And it allows you, again, if you're using technology, it can allow you to raise some flags early on in the process to say, presumably this factory is located in the Guangdong region of China, but for some reason we have someone entering data and adding information to this checklist that are located in the Uyghur region. So that would raise a flag and would warrant further investigation into what might perhaps be going on that you wouldn't have known about otherwise. And then last but not least is supplier engagement and training. And it's certainly not least. And something that we find is always worth our investment in terms of time and resources. So ensuring that the factories, the suppliers, the vendors that you are auditing understand why they're being audited, understand the standards, criteria, or regulatory requirements against which they're auditing, and if they don't, help them understand what those requirements are, how they potentially relate to their organization, and help them understand if they don't have the information at their fingertips to answer the question or provide data and information, where can they go to get that? So supplier engagement and training is, hands down, always an important investment. And again, technology can facilitate that knowledge transfer, that training very, very efficiently. So with that, I wanted to make sure I leave a little bit of time for questions. We have some coming in on the chat, and I'm just going to go through some of those. Terry, we actually have a question for you here to start out.
Brilliant.
Do you think it is easier for auditees to manipulate information during virtual audits? What precautions should virtual auditors take to avoid being misled? Sort of a two-part question.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think it's probably something that does go on relatively often. Kind of gamesmanship. I think wherever you're giving notice as well of an audit, it gives people time to prepare and perhaps present the absolute best version of the operation that might then go back to a lower standard afterwards. I think you just got to be vigilant when you're doing either type of audit, and I think that plays into really know and trust the auditor that you're using. Make sure that they're kind of wise to any common, I don't want to call them tricks, but tactics that people may use. You just have to be vigilant, really. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think there's a lot of incentives for people to try and game the system. So having an experienced person there that's wise to some of those tactics is important. In terms of how you can kind of design that out, I really think it's have a very clear plan for the audit. Be very clear about the information that you need. One thing actually that springs to mind for us is having the right equipment there in some circumstances is very important, and making sure that it's calibrated effectively. This example has just come to mind as I've been talking through here. We had an example in the energy sector where we needed to check the calibration of a piece of lifting equipment, but the tool that was being used to do that didn't have its last certificate there, so it kind of meant that something that we weren't prepared for had to be used. So yeah, I actually think one really interesting angle is making sure that all the equipment is there and that you ahead of time get all the documentation for those pieces of equipment, so you can check through them and make sure that it matches up when you actually get to site. But people are people, aren't they? And I think this is an interesting one that will go on forever no matter what you do.
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts. That's a good point. We have a question for you, Chris. The new normal is a term that's being floated around quite a bit these days. You mentioned that the new normal isn't really new. Can you explain or expand a bit on what you meant about that?
Sure. The new normal is a phrase that's got very popular over the last year. And I hate to say it's mainly driven by analysts and consultants, because it means you buy something new from them. But in essence, every aspect of today's normal existed in yesterday's normal. You had customers, you had suppliers, you had governments, both friendly and hostile. You had multiple bills of material. You had diamond supply chains. You had transportation through multiple modes, manufacturing in different countries, different types of distribution, e-commerce, bricks and mortar, retail, all of that. All of that is still there. What's changed are the priorities we attach to different risks, to different parts of the equation. So for instance, safety stock today is viewed very differently than safety stock was a year ago. Today it's viewed as a hedge to ensure supply and ensure customer availability. A year ago, it was viewed as an evil, something that we try to have to make sure that we don't run out of inventory, but to reduce as much as possible. So the priorities, the ways we look at these parameters have all changed. The parameters and the supply chains themselves have not changed. So if you look at what we saw in the 90s, for instance, the emphasis, and I was one of these people, the emphasis was on engineering the balance sheet. How do we reduce cash to cash? How do we reduce inventory? How do we extend payables? All these things. How do we reduce cost per unit? 10 years later, the same supply chain is shifted to how do we assure supply? How do we minimize risk? How do we maximize customer lifecycle experience? But the supply chain is still the same. That's a really long answer to a short question, but I hope that puts across what I was trying to say.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that, Chris. I appreciate it. I think we have time for one more question, Terry, and this one's for you. Terry, you mentioned that compatibility and accessibility can be issues with regard to technology. What about security concerns?
Yeah, definitely a very important one, and you might want to be checking devices that you're bringing in if it's a high security manufacturing environment. That's something to think about. I think in the engagement with the people that you're working with, that needs to be wrapped up in your terms and conditions about information sharing and what can and can't be shared. But I think as best practice that's generally happening anyway. But yeah, an interesting question, and I think that'll evolve over time.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you both again, Terry Clark and Chris Gopal. And thank you everyone for attending our webinar today. I want to make sure I am respectful of everyone's time. I know what it's like when you have back-to-back calls and you need a little bit of a break sometimes between those. Just a quick note, if you would like to learn more about virtual audits or other supply chain compliance and transparency issues, please visit our Learning Center. We've got some terrific content. You've heard us mention Charlotte. She's in the background, heads up our marketing department. But we've got some really great content housed on our Learning Center blogs, webinars, and white papers that may be of interest. Lastly, we are offering we have a special offer today for webinar attendees, I believe, And if you are interested, but we're offering a 15% off the annual subscription to our virtual audit and risk management solution. I wanted to make sure I described that properly. So again, thank you all very much for attending today. We look forward to seeing you at our next one. I hope you gleaned some nuggets of insight, and take good care of yourselves, and we'll see you again in the not so distant future. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers.